From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. During our first half hour today, Britton Rucker will talk with two of the featured speakers at the 2020 Midwest Cover Crops Conference. Yesterday, near Kansas City, co-sponsored by K-State, both are out of the University of Nebraska. Jay Parsons will discuss management considerations to be included in a cover crop lease agreement. He says there is no one-size-fits-all agreement, meaning that such leases must be crafted carefully. And Mary Drewnoski will talk about lessons she's learned about incorporating cover crops into cropping systems when grazing is a primary goal. Later this week's K-State Horticulture segment, Ward Upham on pruning fruit trees anytime from now until spring greenup. Here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. I'm Britton Rucker. Over the past few days, the Midwest Cover Crops Council Annual Conference took place in Kansas City, Missouri. The Midwest Cover Crops Council aims to effectively achieve the broad adoption of cover crops by farmers and build a vital and effective regional collaboration of agencies, individuals, and the general public. Event sponsors included K-State Research and Extension, MU Extension, University of Nebraska Extension, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Speakers include faculty from MU, University of Nebraska, and Kansas State University, as well as cattle producers and representatives from the NRCS and cattle companies. Sessions looked at using cover crops in row crop production, livestock and grazing, as well as environmental and economic issues. One of the featured speakers at the morning breakout sessions was Jay Parsons, agricultural economist with the University of Nebraska. Jay discussed leasing arrangements in cover crops, and as their name implies, cover crops cover the ground, helping prevent soil erosion outside of the growing season for the primary crop. And below-ground cover crops also contribute to soil organic matter. In addition, many cover crop producers may seek potential income from cattle producers interested in making use of cover crop as a valuable source of feed. Cover crop grazing, like crop residue grazing, is complicated by the crop producer's desire to manage the land in such a way as to maximize profitability. Now, Jay, you really go into there's no one-size-fits-all lease agreement for all situations.
Yeah, there's a lot of unique situations out there, I guess. People just want to say, what do I do for this? And think that everybody's doing the same thing. But, of course, the livestock that are going on there could be quite a bit different, whether they're growing calves or just maintaining cows, the actual forage that's there, and then the infrastructure that's there, whether it's a fenced property and there's water there or not, and what's going on around there in terms of neighbors and all that kind of stuff can make a big difference.
So going right into that, there are cover crop management responsibilities.
Yeah, because people are the crop producers are predominantly managing that cover crop for their crop production system, right? So they have certain goals and objectives that they're trying to reach there with regards to that. The idea of renting it out for grazing is that they're looking to capture some more income, okay? But, of course, from the livestock producers, they're just looking for livestock feed, and for growing animals, they want good performance on there as far as weight gain and so on. So there's different things there in terms of making sure that the soil benefits that they're looking for from a cover crop standpoint, that they're getting the cover they want and the residue left there and all that kind of stuff. They don't want to graze to the ground, for example, very early in the season. And then just basically just managing that soil component of it for them is their objective. So they need to spell that out with the livestock producer ahead of time and make sure there's no misunderstandings in terms of how that land is going to be used.
And on the cattle management side, there are some responsibilities that you dived into there.
Yeah, predominantly, the fencing and the water and the caretaking of them. And that becomes a big issue because we become more specialized, so we tend to have cattle producers over in one area and crop producers in another area. So a lot of times there's a big distance there. So just, who's going to put that infrastructure in place if it's not there, and who's going to be taking care of the cattle in that infrastructure on a regular basis to make sure that everything's going good and the cattle are in and everything's happening fine. So if there's a big distance to travel, the livestock producer might want to pay somebody actually for full care on it, or it might be somewhere in between. But what you don't want to have happen is the livestock producer put them there, crop producer getting mad because the cattle are getting out, or there's sick cows out there and they think something needs to be done or whatever. You just want to spell all that out in the agreement of who's taking care of what.
Now, another big issue and discussion is fencing and water.
Yeah, it can be pretty costly. Temporary fencing isn't too bad, but certainly if there's not water there and you actually have to haul water, and it's not the hauling itself per se that it's expensive. It's the labor component, right? You got to be there every day to make that happen. So that can drive up costs quite a bit, and crop producers need. Most of them do understand, if I don't have water there, I'm not going to be able to rent it out for as much kind of thing. And certainly it's not going to be as appealing to somebody that has to drive a great distance to be there every day to do that. So those are definitely considerations to see who's going to do that. And for some crop producers, especially now with the low commodity prices, that's also an opportunity. This whole thing is an opportunity for them to make money too by providing those as services. So they're not just necessarily renting out the forage for the cattle to eat, but they're actually providing some service there to make it convenient for the cattle producer. And it's a way to capture a little more income, maybe in the off season when they're not actually growing their other crops.
Right. And just the overall daily care is a big consideration as well. Yeah,
because like I said, we've become more specialized, so a lot of the crop producers aren't around or haven't been around cattle for a long time or maybe ever. And so they're not as familiar, with just the everyday care of the cattle, recognizing problems and stuff like that. So yeah, just who's going to do that and how they're going to do that, and everything needs to be spelled out and thought through ahead of time.
Now, Jay, there are some risk management considerations producers and landowners need to keep in mind.
Yeah, from an insurance standpoint, with the annual forages, at least in Nebraska and Kansas and down the middle of the country, there is an annual forage insurance product that's available that covers basically the risk of not having precipitation. So either the forages don't grow or your next crop is somehow hindered because you didn't get enough precip. So that product is available, but in order to take that out, you need to have skin in the game, as they say, that you need to have some risk in there. So who's paying for the establishment of the crop, and then how the actual rental agreement is written up in terms of how the livestock producer is paying the crop producer can make a difference on who actually has the risk there. And so for a livestock producer that's just paying for days of grazing, in the eyes of having risk, they don't have risk, right? If there's not forage there, they just pull them off and they don't have to pay for it. So that's something to consider in terms of how that plays out and who actually is eligible for the insurance and whether or not you want to do it. But then there's just this whole idea of basically the investment of planting the cover crop, who's paying for that, and then the risk of it not growing. So in a general sense, even without the insurance, there's this concept of who's actually taking the risk on this whole thing.
Now, going into that, what are some potential leasing agreements?
We've been getting a lot of questions on this because just to be completely honest, most grazing leasing agreements are handshake deals. And that doesn't work, especially well when you're unfamiliar with the livestock and you're dealing with cropland, for example, that you have other concerns going on. So we're working on getting a leasing agreement approved through our North Central Farm Management Extension Committee, and that should go in later, about a month or so from now. We expect to have that in and under formal review, and so hopefully we can get that approved yet this year in time for people to use later this summer and into the fall. But some of these things that we've talked about need to be spelled out in there, along with all the legal stuff in terms of who the people are, where the property is, how long the cattle can be on there, and those types of things. All need to be spelled out in that agreement. And we tend to, the misnomer is that if we have to put things in writing, we don't trust each other, and why can't we just trust each other kind of thing. But the truth of the matter is when you put it in writing, you basically get rid of some potential misunderstandings. Right. So we might trust each other now, but when we have a misunderstanding, suddenly things break down, and they can break down in a hurry. And just by the act of putting it down in writing, if we can eliminate some of those issues, it can be a really good deal and basically put us in position for more of a long-term profitable relationship in terms of grazing and stuff. So.
Exactly. And you showed attendees here at the conference a example lease agreement.
Yeah, and I basically am overwhelmed by how long it gets when you start trying to put all this stuff in here. So it's like 6 pages long right now as we have it spelled out. But, you don't have to fill all of it out, but we try to set it up to where it's convenient. So some of the things we talked about with watering and fencing and animal care and stuff like that, and who's responsible for that, we set up with just kind of a 2-column check thing on the landlord or the tenant. And so hopefully people will find it useful. And like I said, you don't have to put too much detail in there, but there's some things where it can really basically take care of some potential misunderstandings and get it cleared up ahead of time.
Right. Even a little bit can go a long ways in these situations. Yeah,
because you're dealing with two parties that maybe know each other but haven't really had a business relationship at all before, and so it's just always good to make sure that everybody's on the same page, so that you don't get off. And some of the simplest things can set people off, right? So there's damage to something, and it's like, well, you got to pay for that, and somebody else says, well, no, why would I pay for that? That's why would I buy you a brand new one? There, it was almost wore out anyway, kind of stuff. So if you can just set that out front and make sure that if this happens or that happens, everything's okay.
Well, a big thank you to Jay Parsons, agricultural economist with the University of Nebraska, who was a featured speaker at the morning breakout session at the 2020 Midwest Cover Crops Conference held in Kansas City. Once again, Jay spoke on leasing arrangements and covered major management considerations to include in a lease arrangement, as well as risk management aspects to think about when putting it together. We'll have more from the Midwest Cover Crops Conference after these short moments. I'm Britton Recker, and this is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Britton Recker at the 2020 Midwest Cover Crop Conference in Kansas City, and one main topic full of intrigue is cow-calf grazing cover crops, and the presenter of that topic is Mary Drewnoski from the University of Nebraska. Now, Mary, you've truly lived through some life lessons in incorporating cover crops into cropping systems.
Sure. So I've made a lot of mistakes using cover crops in cropping systems, especially with the goal of grazing either calves or cows. And one of the big ones that I made initially, honestly, was thinking that I could get something for nothing, so to speak. There are risks with trying to use cover crops. You're usually got short windows to grow something, you got short windows to try to graze something, and sometimes, well, Mother Nature just doesn't cooperate. But boy, when it does, it is almost a slam dunk.
Now, what are some considerations for producers when selecting cover crops?
I think the number one thing when selecting a cover crop is knowing what your goals are. And so what I have experience in is a goal for forage production. And then after that, it's really about planting date. And planting date is the huge thing to actually tell you what I should plant. Because if you're trying to plant, let's say, in late summer, so let's say late July through August, the species you would select is very different than if I'm going to try to plant something after corn, for instance, in November. So planting in that time period of August leaves you the opportunity to produce quite a bit of biomass. And so for people who have wheat, you can either plant early in the July period, plant some warm seasons, get a lot of biomass, a little bit lower quality. Or if you delay planting, then you can plant something that's going to give you, maybe a ton and a half of biomass, but it's really high quality and great for calves. So if I'm going for cows, I'm probably going to go the early route if I'm doing wheat. If I'm going for calves, I'm probably going to delay planting and go with a higher quality. And then if I can't get it in if I can't get it in until September, I'm probably just going to go with something that's winter hardy and hope to get something in the spring out of it, because likely something that's going to winter kill isn't going to produce much.
And crop rotation plays a factor into that as well.
Yeah, so of course crop rotation plays a role in when you can plant, but it also plays a role in when you want to be able to graze. And in particular, the one I see is corn and soybean systems. If I'm going, let's say, before soybeans, I have a little bit longer leeway for most people. They'd plant their soybeans a little bit later, although there's some data that suggests maybe we should be planting them before corn. But the other thing is that soybeans seem to be way more forgiving for having a grass before them. And so planting something and having like rye or triticale before soybeans, I can actually usually be able to go in and actually plant my soybeans and then kill my grass. I can't do that with corn as well. And in fact, most people suggest we got to go ahead and actually kill that cover crop early, so that we have time between that cover crop and corn. Otherwise, we can have some negative effects on corn. Well, the windows are already short for grazing, so depending on what I'm doing, that kind of becomes a challenge. So if I have multiple fields, those fields that are going to go to soybeans, they may be a lot easier to put a cover crop in that you're going to use in the spring.
Back to considerations when grazing, there are some risks when grazing cattle on cover crops in November and December.
Yeah, it's all about weather. So the risks really in my mind are it can be wet, which means we can trample in a lot of forage, or we can have problems with actually the cattle having to use a lot of energy essentially to stay warm. Now that's not just a cover crop problem, that's a winter problem. But what we do see is it makes it really hard to know how cattle are going to perform. And in particular, if I'm growing calves and I have target end weights, sometimes, life is really good and they gain 2 pounds a day, and sometimes life isn't so great and they only gain 1 pound a day. And sometimes we get ice and we have to pull and we can't graze it. And then it may be that we can come in at another time and make use of it, or it may be that just becomes residue for the next year. So it's not always a win, but when it is, it's really quite a nice type of system to have, and I love seeing cattle out there grazing.
Now, Mary, what are some establishing costs to cover crops?
Well, everybody knows seed costs, and I really think that you got to be paying attention to seed costs, especially if you're thinking about forage production, because you can get very expensive very quickly with some of these mixes. Grass is king in terms of biomass production, so if I'm looking for forage, I'm not going to skimp on the grass. Grass also is fairly cheap. The other one that's fairly cheap and can produce a lot of biomass are brassicas, so turnips, radishes. I really like rapeseed as an option. But then you can get into really expensive when you start adding legumes. And depending on how short your growing season is, the legumes may or may not produce much biomass, and it's really hard for a legume to compete with a grass. So to me, I kind of keep it simple and make sure I have a lot of grass in that mix. Then we got to think about drilling cost or application costs, and those can be just as much as the seed cost, depending on how expensive you get on seed. So seed, I often am planting somewhere around $20 an acre in seed cost, and my drilling rates usually between 10 to 18, depending on who's doing it and what they're using, $10 to $18 an acre. And then, honestly, the next question is, what else do I need? Mm-hmm. And it depends on the system, and it depends on the crop rotation. You may or may not need nitrogen fertilizer. I told you not to skimp on the grass for seed. The seeding rates for cover crops, when you're just wanting it for soil health and when you want it for forage, are different. And usually the seeding rates for forage is higher. And so do plant the higher rates. Go based off of the recommendations for forage. Don't get too lazy with the seeding.
Now, a lot of considerations in cover crops, and you actually did a late summer plant to late graze fall comparison.
So I did a comparison of late summer planting, and I looked at different species that we planted. And in particular, the one that we were looking at that was really interesting to me was we compared a monoculture of oats to a a mix of oats and rapeseed for calves. And so we planted 50 pounds of oats plus 3 pounds of rapeseed per acre, or 100 pounds of oats. And we can get the same yields, but we can get $5 cheaper seed costs by adding the brassica in there because brassicas are cheap. And then we got about 1/10 of a pound a day gain better, and that's pretty consistent. So we can have less costs and better performance. So to me, that was a win-win.
Now, you discussed in your presentation also a pivot fence can play a big role in grazing efficiency.
Yeah, so one of the things is that cover crops can be very high quality, especially if you have a short growing season because they don't get mature. And if I'm trying to use it for an animal that has fairly low requirements, like in the winter, a dry cow, a cow who's not lactating, she doesn't have very high requirements. If I have a forage that's really high quality, well, I can either put a lot of condition on her, or I can limit her access and actually stretch that forage out further, keep that cow in good condition, but I can make really great use of the forage. And pivot fence is a great way to do it. In particular, we did some work out at Clay Center, Nebraska, where we had between 200 and 400 cows out in a pivot field, and we essentially just moved that pivot fence every day just a little bit. They were getting like 1/8 of an acre of an oat brassica mix, and they maintained condition. Actually, they gained a little bit of condition, and we were able to get 4 AUMs per acre, which what that really means is we were able to graze essentially a cow for 4 months per acre, which is just amazing. So that was a very cost-effective system. You don't have to have a pivot fence to do that. I mean, you can go out and allocate with temporary fences and accomplish the same thing. The pivot fence is just kind of nice because it's a little bit easier because I don't actually have to move posts every day. The pivot is my posts.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mary, last question. What is the importance and benefit of grazing cover crops?
The importance and benefits of grazing cover crops. Well, to me, one of the big benefits as a cattle producer is that it can be cost effective, and so it's money in my pocket. Some of the other things that we do see is we do see some stimulation of the soil biology. And in particular, we see an uptick in the amount of total microbes in the soil. And in fact, that can be a real positive because we can really get nutrient cycling and we can get things going in the soil that can impact subsequent crops. And we've seen that with, in particular, actually residue grazing. So corn residue grazing, we've actually seen that long term, like 16 years of grazing, we actually saw consistently greater corn yields where we grazed the stalks than where we didn't. At the same time, if I'm in a system where I don't have a lot of carbon, so in that particular system, we were 200 bushel corn.
Well, a big thank you to Mary Drewnoski from the University of Nebraska for coming and speaking on incorporating cover crops into cropping systems at the 2020 Midwest Cover Crop Conference in Kansas City. I'm Britton Rucker, and this is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And on now to today's Agriculture News page. And these headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. USDA Inspector General Phyllis Fong told lawmakers this week that her office is reviewing the USDA's authority to provide the more than $20 billion in direct payments to producers without an appropriation from Congress via that market facilitation program. She also said that office will look at questions on whether that aid is unfairly tilted to certain states and commodity groups. Speaking at a House Appropriations Subcommittee hearing, Fong said, quoting here, "The first piece of our work should be coming out in the next several months." Senate Agriculture Committee ranking member Debbie Stabenow has complained repeatedly that the aid is tilted to southern states based on the per-acre payments via the 2019 MFP effort, while the USDA continues to point to the totals received by states in the Midwest, with Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, Texas, and Minnesota receiving the most. As of February the 10th, the USDA said that $14.2 billion has been paid out under MFP2. U.S. pork exports finished 2019 on a high note, setting new records for both value and volume. This according to statistics released by the USDA and compiled by the U.S. Meat Export Federation. For the year, 5.9 billion pounds of U.S. pork and pork variety meats, valued at $6.9 billion, were exported to countries around the world. That was up 10% and 9%, respectively, from 2018. Pork exports accounting for 27% of total 2019 U.S. pork production. Export value per head averaging $53.50. That was up 4% from 2018. According to the president of the National Pork Board, David Newman, China was the main driver for the record-breaking pace of U.S. pork exports last year. While exports to China were higher in 19, key U.S. pork customers, including Japan and Mexico, saw significant declines as the U.S. worked to negotiate new trade deals with each country. Now, Japan has historically been the leading market for U.S. pork in terms of value, as well as the leading destination for U.S. chilled pork loins. In 2019, the U.S. held 46% of Japan's market for chilled pork. That was down from 70% in 2018. Mexico remains the top market for U.S. pork by volume, with over 1.5 billion pounds of pork and pork variety meat exported there in 2019. Tyson Foods says it's just starting to see the pork sales benefit of the African swine fever outbreak in China, including a 600% year-over-year increase in pork orders to China in the fiscal first quarter. The meat producer says it's moving toward a ractopamine-free hog supply, which should open additional markets for its pork products. Ractopamine, as you know, a feed additive that is banned in some countries. In fact, global demand for all proteins is increasing as African swine fever continues to reduce pork supplies in Asia. That according to the chief executive officer of the company, Noel White, as he reviewed the company's earnings last week. Tyson also anticipates double the demand for chicken in China. Is the situation with the coronavirus causing a slowdown in China's imports of U.S. soybeans? The USDA's Gary Crawford takes a look.
In USDA's new crop supply and demand forecasts this week, it did not make a lot of changes to its previous projections for U.S. soybeans, but the changes it did make were fairly significant. First,
we increased our export forecast by 50 million bushels.
USDA's acting outlook chairman, Mark Jekanowski, says that takes soybean exports up to just over 1.8 billion bushels, 77 million more than last year.
Much of that going to China, and that's also supported by data within China that shows their soybean crush increasing as well. So they're buying more soybeans both from the U.S. and globally as well.
But what about the problems with the coronavirus? Hasn't that slowed down China's imports of beans?
Longer term, it could potentially have an impact, but we haven't seen an impact yet.
However, the other change USDA made this week was to drop its previous forecast for $9 a bushel soybeans by 25 cents to $8.75 based on prices up to now, and also on news that Brazil is currently harvesting what could be a record-large soybean crop. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
And that rolls us right into this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. Standing by, as always, Greg Akagi. Greg?
Keenan McRoberts is joining us. He is Vice President of Meal Strategy with the United Soybean Board. And Keenan, I know for U.S. soy industry, there is a big initiative right now talking about Protein First and to help many across the world. Can you explain what Protein First is?
Protein First is an initiative together with the United Soybean Board and partners like the American Soybean Association, World Initiative for Soy and Human Health, and U.S. Soybean Export Council that really identifies the critical role of protein in global population growth and global nutrition. So through this platform, U.S. soy is reaffirming its commitment to animal agriculture while also positioning U.S. soy as a preferred protein in the plant protein space.
because there is demand for that throughout the world as well.
Yeah, that's right. So really, global demand for protein is driven by what is currently a supply-demand gap in emerging economies, and that growth is going to continue over time. To feed a population of 9 billion by 2050, we've got to focus on growing all sources of protein to supply that gap in a sustainable way, and U.S. soy plays a critical role in that process.
And that relationship with animal agriculture, as you said, growing the protein across the world, you have to have that relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. As economies grow, growing middle class, the increase in consumption of animal-sourced protein is a key part of protein demand growth. So really, we're reaffirming our commitment to animal agriculture partners through this Protein First initiative, while acknowledging that we play a critical role both in the plant and the animal protein space.
What's the biggest way that you do promote that across the world?
So really through our partners with the U.S. Soybean Export Council and the World Initiative for Soy and Human Health, those are the entities that are focused on protein demand growth in those emerging economies, including in places like sub-Saharan Africa.
And that's big because of the fact that very much a need for protein in those areas too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned before the protein supply-demand gap. So protein requirements currently and the demand that would be created by those ideal requirements are less than what's available in those economies. It can't be supplied through local sources, so that creates an opportunity for trade. And U.S. agriculture can provide that trade component, that supply of sustainably produced protein that can feed that growing population in those emerging economies.
All right, Keenan, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
That is Keenan McRoberts, Vice President of Meal Strategy with the United Soybean Board, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Thanks, Greg. This week's horticulture segment coming your way next. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
With a shortage of primary care positions, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State research and extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. Coming your way next to this week's horticulture segment. And yes, we've a project for you home fruit gardeners to take on, even this far ahead of the spring season. Joining us is Ward Upham, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension, to go over the steps to pruning fruit trees. And this, over the next few weeks, you say, Ward, would be the ideal opportunity to clean those trees up.
That's right. Any time between now and the end of March would be a good time to get this done. That tree hasn't invested a lot of energy into putting out leaves, and therefore when you prune them, you're not really taking away much of the energy that it is used to do that.
So this needs to be done a certain way, and we want to go over the steps here. But in particular with younger fruit trees, this is often referred to as training the tree, Ward?
That's right. And so when you have a young fruit tree, let's say the year you plant it, normally I say do not prune at all, except in a couple of instances. One is if you have a branch that is broken, just prune it back to an existing bud. The other exception is that if you have whip, in other words, a tree that doesn't have any side branches, cut it back again to above an existing bud about 36 inches. That will force those side branches in order to grow, and therefore you can start really shaping the tree the next year. That first year of planting, you want as many leaves as possible in order to give that energy that tree needs in order to get established.
So then, if we look at the older trees and maintenance pruning that might be required, other steps that would be beneficial here?
That's right. So there's certain principles that we want to follow. First thing to remember is whenever you cut something off, it's always back to an existing bud or to an existing branch. You never leave a stub. That stub, if it's left, will be an entry point for disease and insects. So you want to make sure you don't leave any stubs. Okay, first step is take out any broken, damaged, or diseased branches. Those are things that aren't doing that tree any good and, again, are something that can harm the tree over the long term. If 2 branches form a narrow angle, one of them has to go. You could take both of them out if that's appropriate, but at least one of them has to go. Those narrow angles are weak, and they will tend to break during wind and ice storms. Then take out all suckers. Now, suckers are those growths that come from the base of the tree, around the trunk, or even outside the tree from the roots. They grow straight up, and they are actually from a part of the tree called the rootstock. Those have to go. If there's any left in the spring, take them out. But during this season, if they form during the growing season, take them out then. It's actually better to do it that way. The second thing to take out are water sprouts. Now, water sprouts come from existing branches, and they go straight up. Again, if there's any left in the spring, take them out then, but it's better to take them out during the growing season. Wait and take them all out in the spring. You encourage that tree to produce more. If you take them out during the growing season, that takes care of them, and you're less likely to get very many the next year. Next, if you have two branches that cross and rub, one of them has to go. And then cut back branches to reduce the total size of the tree so it's easier to handle. And the last thing is thin branches on the interior of the tree. Now, once you hit 30% of the tree, you stop. Okay? If you go over that, they can encourage too much growth, especially with the water sprouts and the suckers. Now, the exception of that is going to be peaches. Peaches you prune back hard every year. The reason for that is that peaches only bear on wood that was grown the previous year, on 1-year-old wood. If you don't prune those back hard, that wood is going to be further and further from the center of the tree. And once that tree does bear fruit, it's going to tend to break the tree apart. So you're going to take out at least 30% of a peach tree. Some people will take out 40% or even a little more. Just make sure you're making those branches shorter so that when you have a fruit load, it's going to be closer to the interior of the tree. Peaches do not bear every year in Kansas. Even if you don't get a fruit crop, these trees need to be pruned.
So there are special rules for the peach tree.
Yes.
Any other trees that have their own distinctive requirements here?
Yeah, apples. Apples are one that you really need to prune every year. Again, on those, not over 30%. But if you let them go and don't prune them, you're going to get an awful lot of growth that's going to tend to break apart in ice and windstorms. And so make sure that they're pruned every year. And just follow those principles we gave you before. If you prune an apple tree correctly, you should be able to throw a softball through that tree. Okay, that's what you're heading for, is something that is thin enough you could throw a softball through it. That makes sure sunlight gets all the way through the tree and causes that fruit to color well. If sunlight doesn't hit a fruit, it doesn't color well. And for commercial growers, that's a big deal, because if it doesn't color, it doesn't sell. It'll taste okay. And so if you're a home gardener, it's not as important, but still something you need to watch.
And while we're on that subject, if an apple tree is in fact overgrown, you would encourage the grower to take action fairly soon.
Yes, and if it's really, really overgrown, like it's been neglected for years, really the best thing to do is just make one pruning cut at ground level. It's a whole lot easier to do that and plant a new tree than it is to bring it back. But let's say it's Grandpa's tree and you're willing to do anything to bring it back. And so when you start on a tree like that, you take out the big stuff first. People tend to cut a little bit here and there. No, you start out with the big stuff. Anything that's diseased, anything that crosses, you stop at 30%. That tree is going to react to that. It's going to put up a whole bunch of water sprouts, put up a whole bunch of suckers, and you need to take those out during the growing season. If you wait till the next spring, there's going to be tons of those. And when you take them out, you're going to encourage the tree just to produce more. So first year, take out major branches that don't fit. Second year, bring the height of the tree down. And again, that second year, you're going to take out enough. When you stop at that 30%, they're going to have a bunch of water sprouts and suckers that need to be taken out during the growing season.
And lastly, you say there are some special guidelines for other trees like cherries, pears, plums.
Yeah, they really don't need a whole lot. And so light pruning, any tree, you can take out 10% of the tree any time of the year. You're not going to hurt anything. And that's probably all that cherry, plum, and pear need. And so anything that crosses, weak angles, that type of stuff, and that's it.
Well, if you have a relatively tolerable day outside in the coming weeks, this is a great time to get this done, Ward, before the growing season begins. And so,
yes.
And as a final thought, folks often come to the conclusion that they might ruin the tree or hamper it by pruning. Quite the opposite here.
Yeah, it is better for the tree that you prune it. And again, if you follow these principles, you're going to be fine. Don't worry that you're making a wrong cut as long as you follow the principles.
And by the way, these are fully outlined in more detail in the K-State Horticulture newsletter recently. You can find that on the K-State Horticulture website. Check that out. Ward, as always, thanks.
You bet.
Horticulturist Ward Upham, K-State Research and Extension, on fruit tree pruning here in the coming weeks on this week's Horticulture segment. And that is our time for today. As always, thanks to you for being along with us. For Britton Rucker, Eric Atkinson here, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.